Raxel paused, lifting a clawed hand to signal his team. He had caught it, a faint trace in the air, the barest scent of his prey. Human. A lone creature, deep in territory he couldn't possibly comprehend. He clenched his mandibles in satisfaction, certain of his impending triumph. What could one human, outmatched in strength and numbers, do against him and his seasoned hunting party? Scanning the shadows, Raxel's keen eyes absorbed the slightest movements, a leaf shivering, the flick of a tail as some local creature darted into hiding. He recognized the usual signs of retreat. Lesser beings sensed his presence and fled before him. He relished the fear he inspired, the power he held over the wild things. And now, somewhere ahead, his prey lurked. He would try to flee, he was sure, though there was nowhere to hide that his senses would not find him. The team advanced, slipping between broad fronds and under tangled vines, communicating with the silent gestures of well-practiced comrades. Each one's pride was bound to the success of this hunt. They were here not only to capture but to demonstrate their dominance, to prove that the most challenging game in the universe could not evade their pursuit. As they pressed forward, Raxel noted strange patterns in the disturbed foliage, an odd rhythm to the way twigs were snapped and ferns parted. Humans were careless by nature, always stumbling through alien worlds as if they were extensions of their own. Yet this one, he was moving with a degree of caution, with intention. That struck him as peculiar. His lieutenant, Vekar, flared his nostrils, catching the same scent. "He is close," he muttered, the rough edges of his voice tinged with excitement. "Silence!" Raxel hissed, irritation rippling through him. The human's location was a delicate matter. He wouldn't allow anything to disturb his concentration. But the lieutenant's words had only confirmed what Raxel already knew. He was close. Closer, perhaps, than they realized. They moved forward, cautious yet eager, the scent of adrenaline filling the air as their target drew nearer. The thrill of the hunt pulsated in Raxel's veins. But he couldn't shake the faint prickling along his spine, a sensation he dismissed as excitement, though somewhere, buried beneath his confidence, a shadow of doubt flickered. The silence in the jungle felt unnatural now. Usually, the Valtari hunt would stir the creatures into a cacophony of warning calls, a silent understanding passing between them of the deadly beings moving through their home. But tonight, the jungle had quieted. Raxel's brow furrowed as he looked around. There was only silence and shadow. He tightened his grip on his weapon, nodding for his team to fan out. Ahead, he noticed the faintest glint, something reflecting the low, phosphorescent light of a nearby plant. A metal casing, perhaps a piece of human technology? He moved toward it, his steps slow and deliberate. If he had dropped his equipment, it could mean he was desperate, scrambling in a futile attempt to evade him. But as he drew closer, his sharp eyes picked up something else, a barely perceptible pattern, lines dug into the dirt, forming an intricate design he couldn't quite place. This wasn't random, it was purposeful. He stopped, suspicion starting to creep in, a sensation as alien as the forest surrounding him. Before he could react, a distant snap echoed behind them. His lieutenant stumbled forward, cursing as his leg caught in a snare. Raxel's gaze shifted, and suddenly he saw the signs for what they were. These weren't the chaotic marks of a fleeing creature. They were deliberate. The human wasn't running. He was leading. The revelation slammed into him, a jolt that shot through his entire frame. His teeth bared, his claws flexing in a combination of frustration and something he refused to name. Fear. He had been guiding them, positioning them exactly where he wanted. The terrain wasn't a hindrance to his. It was his ally. He straightened, eyes narrowing as he peered into the dark underbrush, understanding dawning with chilling clarity. Somewhere, just beyond his sight, he was there, watching him, tracking him. This was no prey. For the first time in his long and storied career, Commander Raxel was uncertain if he was the hunter, or the hunted. The underbrush rustled softly as he moved, his steps light, his breathing controlled. The Valtari were close now. He could feel them pressing through the jungle in tight formation, following his trail, oblivious to the fact that it was he who was leading them deeper, not the other way around. Lieutenant Ryan Hudson had never anticipated being on this planet, but he was trained for moments like this, trained to adapt, to turn the tables, and to make any terrain his ally. It was almost dark beneath the dense canopy, but he didn't need to see. Every plant, every tree branch, every stone and shadow was etched into his mind, laid out in a perfect map that he could navigate with instinct alone. The Valtari moved with practiced stealth, but their confidence made them reckless. They knew only one kind of hunt, the one where they were the predators. Hudson had watched them from the shadows, observing their formation and noting their vulnerabilities. Their arrogance made them blind. They hadn't even tried to mask their scent, the faint but unmistakable musk of alien physiology lingering in the air. It was an oversight that would cost them. He had laid his path carefully, scattering false leads, creating trails that looped back on themselves, and even planting a piece of equipment here and there. He'd seen the moment the leader, their commander, had noticed it. The flicker of curiosity and frustration had crossed his face, a momentary lapse in his cold, calculating gaze. That was the first sign of weakness. It was a weakness Hudson intended to exploit fully. He had never been a hunter before in the literal sense. His battles were in urban landscapes, in tight, controlled combat zones. Here, in the jungle, he felt his senses sharpen, the world around him narrowing to the pulse of his heartbeat, the soft crunch of leaves underfoot, and the distant sounds of his enemy pressing closer, thinking themselves unseen. One of the aliens let out a guttural snarl, breaking the silence, followed by a sharp exhale as something snapped beneath him. Hudson's traps were rudimentary, built from native materials and designed to slow them down or knock them off balance. He had no illusions about what they could accomplish alone. They were only pieces in the puzzle he was crafting to dismantle their confidence. Another alien growled as he cut his companion free, muttering in their native tongue. He couldn't understand the words, but he recognized the anger and frustration lacing each syllable. He moved on, slipping silently into a new position, his senses keenly attuned to every shift in the atmosphere. He didn't need to take them all out, not yet. He needed only to keep them guessing, to shake their certainty, and force them into mistakes. A rustle to his right brought his focus sharply to the movement. The alien commander, he'd come to recognize him by his quiet authority, the way the others glanced to him for confirmation even in silence, was observing his surroundings with new caution, his narrowed eyes scanning the trees and ground, his body tense. Hudson smirked, the faintest hint of satisfaction flaring within him. He was starting to understand that this wasn't a simple hunt. The others were restless now, their movements less synchronized, their disciplines slipping as they each sought to find his first, to end the tension they'd clearly begun to feel. But there was no haste in him. Every movement he made, every trap he set, was deliberate, controlled. They would exhaust themselves chasing shadows before they ever found him. A sudden snap echoed through the jungle as one of his traps triggered again, this time with a sharp clang that brought the alien's head snapping in the direction of the noise. Another Valtari had been caught, his leg end snared in a clever knot of vines, his furious curses loud in the darkening jungle. The commander rushed to him, bending low to inspect the snare, but there was no relief in his expression. Hudson saw it clearly from his hiding place, a flash of doubt in his eyes, quickly replaced by simmering rage. His pride was taking blows now, not only his mission. The tension among the Valtari was palpable, their whispered words growing sharp, their eyes darting more frequently into the shadows. They hadn't anticipated resistance. They hadn't expected a fight. Hudson crouched, silent and waiting, letting the jungle's thick, verdant shroud work its magic, masking his form as he took careful aim with his silenced rifle. He didn't fire. He wanted them on edge, guessing at every sound, questioning every motion. They regrouped, the commander barking orders in clipped tones, pushing them forward as though sheer will could undo his careful web of misdirection. But as they moved deeper, Hudson saw him glance over his shoulder. It was only for an instant, a brief flicker of instinct, but it told him everything. Commander Raxel, this alien veteran who had crossed galaxies to hunt him, was beginning to realize that he was in a game he did not understand. And for the first time, Hudson could feel the shift, a charge of anticipation, knowing the power in this jungle was his alone. The jungle had drawn in on them like a tightening snare, shadows clustering thickly around the Valtari as they advanced with wary, uneven steps. Raxel's usual confidence had become a brittle shell. It showed in his silence, in the tension knotting his shoulders, and in the quick glances he cast toward the undergrowth. The rest of his team moved more stiffly, their smooth coordination fraying with every step. What had begun as a simple hunt had turned into a dance of missteps and frustrations, and none of them could ignore it any longer. The human was controlling this terrain, not them. Hudson was waiting in the heart of his trap. He had lured them here carefully, pulling them along a twisting route filled with subtle obstacles and misdirections. Now, he crouched behind a fallen log, his camouflage blending perfectly with the wet leaves and moss that coated him. The Valtari were mere feet away. He could hear the alien commander's breathing, shallow and ragged, a predator pushed to the edge of his nerves. Every so often, he would raise his hand, and the group would stop, scanning the trees, seeking him. But their movements were jerky, uncertain. He watched with steady patience, his hand resting on the small device he'd buried beneath the leaves in front of him. His traps had done their work, planting seeds of doubt, exhausting their minds as much as their bodies. Now, the final blow would fall. Hudson's thumb pressed down. A sudden burst of smoke erupted from the ground, hissing and billowing through the trees. The Valtari recoiled, their vision obscured, weapons raised in panicked reflex. He heard Raxel bark orders, but confusion tangled their ranks. As they spun in the mist, he slipped away silently, positioning himself behind them, watching as they moved like lost creatures in a maze of their own making. One of the aliens, younger and quicker to panic, broke from the group, stumbling backward with eyes darting wildly. Hudson saw his chance and struck, his blade flashing in the dim light as he brought it down cleanly across his throat. He slumped, silent, crumpling into the thick foliage as he retreated back into the cover of the jungle. The others heard nothing, too engrossed in their disorientation, their nerves stretched thin. Raxel was at the center, desperately trying to rally his team, calling out in short, clipped tones. His authority was faltering, slipping through his grasp with every second that passed. Hudson circled, his footsteps silent as he moved from one shadow to the next, a phantom haunting their every move. A second trap went off, a small explosive that sent shrapnel scattering through the air, piercing the legs of another Valtari soldier. He howled, collapsing as his companions swarmed to his aid. Their confusion had turned to desperation, the cold precision of their earlier formation now a chaotic sprawl. Raxel's voice rose above the chaos, fierce but tinged with an unmistakable edge of fear. Hudson saw him draw his weapon, his claws flexing around it as he searched for any sign of him. His eyes, once sharp and certain, now betrayed his exhaustion, his own disbelief at what the hunt had become. He let him feel it, savoring the growing realization in his gaze that he, the commander, had been outmatched, brought low by the very creature he had dismissed as prey. He fired a shot, quick and precise, striking one of the soldiers who had wandered too far from the others. He fell without a sound, his body thudding against the ground, unnoticed until another Valtari stumbled upon him and cried out in alarm. Raxel whirled, his breathing heavy, his composure unraveling thread by thread. He turned in circles, as though expecting him to appear from every shadow, from every corner of the darkened jungle. But Hudson stayed hidden, watching, a silent hunter with the patience of stone. He saw him tremble, the sharp lines of his authority cracking with each heartbeat. The fear in his eyes had become a visible weight, pressing down on him, thickening the air around him. His shoulders hunched, his stance defensive, not the posture of a hunter, but of one who was being hunted. And then, with an expression of grim resignation, Raxel raised his head, his gaze sweeping the jungle as he bared his teeth in a final display of defiance. His voice rang out, raw and challenging. "Come, human!" he snarled, voice trembling with forced courage. "Face me!" But his shout was swallowed by the jungle's vast, indifferent silence. Hudson stayed in place, invisible, unyielding, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. He let his challenge hang in the air, unanswered, until the silence pressed down on him like a weight. Raxel's breaths came faster, his bravado melting into stark, unfiltered fear. The jungle closed in around them once more, and in that silence, he understood, he would face him, but only on his terms. And when he did, he would know it. The jungle lay still, shrouded in silence, its thick shadows an unbreakable wall around Commander Raxel. The Valtari warriors, once so sure of their dominance, were now scattered remnants, defeated by an enemy they had never expected to fear. Raxel stood alone, his chest heaving as he gripped his weapon, his pride shredded by a relentless truth. He was not the hunter here. Hudson moved through the trees, his steps noiseless, his form blended seamlessly into the dense foliage. He watched Raxel's frantic gaze darting across the terrain, saw the glint of his weapon catching the faint light as he turned. He was listening intently, his body rigid, every instinct primed for an attack. Yet in his eyes he saw the tremor of a seasoned warrior brought low by the weight of uncertainty, a predator who had glimpsed the vulnerability that lay beneath his own strength. He shifted his stance, his muscles tense, his breaths ragged. Hudson could feel his desperation, his defiance balanced on the edge of collapse. He held his position, biding him time, letting the silence thicken between them like a living thing. The jungle seemed to pulse with each measured beat of his heart, drawing Raxel deeper into the grip of dread he couldn't shake. Finally, he stepped forward, making his presence known with a deliberate scrape of his boot against a rock. Raxel whipped around, eyes wide, weapon aimed with lethal precision. Hudson stood in the half-light, his face obscured by the shadows but his posture relaxed, every inch the confident predator he had once claimed to be. "You came here for a hunt," he said. "Tell me, Commander, was it worth it?" He hesitated, an instinctive flinch betraying the strain of his pride wrestling with fear. His mandibles flared in a futile attempt at intimidation, but his voice faltered as he spoke. "I am Valtari," he spat, trying to reclaim a shred of his authority. "I will not be toyed with by some human." Hudson's expression remained impassive. Each step he took seemed to weigh on him, an unspoken reminder of every advantage he'd seized, every trap he had laid with flawless precision. His claws tightened on his weapon, but his eyes betrayed the doubts churning within him. "No more games, then," he replied. "If you want a final fight, I'm here." Raxel growled, his body tensing, but Hudson sensed the exhaustion beneath his defiance. He raised his weapon, lunging with desperate speed, aiming to end him quickly. But Hudson had anticipated it, moving fluidly aside, his form a blur as he countered, using his momentum against him. He ducked beneath his swing, his fist colliding with his jaw in a forceful strike that sent him reeling backward, stunned. He recovered quickly, rage flashing in his eyes, but his attacks were becoming wild, unhinged by frustration. Hudson blocked his strikes with efficient precision, deflecting each blow with a calm that only deepened his panic. His movements became frantic, his breaths ragged, and he sensed the moment his resolve began to waver, the subtle shift as he realized he was facing a foe he couldn't outmaneuver. Finally, Hudson struck with a final blow that sent him sprawling to the ground, his weapon clattering beside him. He stood over him, watching as he struggled to rise, his defiance flickering like the last embers of a fire. His gaze met him, a mixture of anger and fear mirrored in his eyes, and he saw the pride crumble as he lowered his head, defeated. Hudson crouched beside him. "You underestimated us," he said. "You thought you were the only predator out here. But you forgot one thing, Commander: humans adapt." Raxel's gaze fell, his once steadfast confidence reduced to ashes in the face of his victory. He rose, leaving him in silence, his body slumped and spirit broken. Turning, he disappeared back into the shadows, the jungle reclaiming him as its own. As Hudson moved through the dense foliage, the remnants of the Valtari hunt fading behind him, a sense of finality settled over him. He had conquered them not with brute force, but with patience, with strategy, with the resilience they had so gravely misjudged. The jungle was silent, as if honoring his triumph, each shadow an unspoken reminder that he had turned this alien world into his own domain. Raxel would return to his people, if he survived, bearing the tale of a lone human who had become the hunter. The story would spread, a whispered warning to those who sought to prey on his kind. And with each step he took into the fading light, Hudson knew his message had been delivered. Humanity was not just prey, but a force, as cunning and formidable as any who dared to challenge them.